You're listening to WPRS
on the Z Talk Radio Network.
The next stop is the Warren Exchange Paranormal Radio Show on the Z Talk Radio Network.
The views expressed and opinions given by the individual hosts and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Z Talk Radio, its affiliates, or sponsors.
Are you sitting comfortably? Then we'll begin.
The Warren Exchange, with your hosts, Al Warren and Julie Hughes.
Tonight we have an extra special show. I have two guests. We have medium Julie Savelle, who's from the UK and co-hosts with me on the Warren Exchange Paranormal Radio Show. And we have Mark Anthony, who's a psychic lawyer and practicing as a medium, communicates with spirits, and he's a licensed attorney. Now, what Mark's done is he's written a second book called Evidence of Eternity. And we're going to talk about how that's different from other books written by psychics, as well as touch off on his first book, the best-selling Never Letting Go, right after this word.
While the world needs saving, prizes need winning at Subway. Grab a 30-ounce drink or Doritos snacks for a chance to win subs for life, movie tickets, and more. And catch Marvel's Avengers Age of Ultron now in theaters. Subway, where superheroes eat.
He's not dead. Yes, he is. I'm not.
We're back, and joining us tonight, we have Mark Anthony. He's the psychic lawyer, and he's just written a new book, The Evidence of Eternity. And we want to welcome you to the show, and thank you for taking the time to sit with us.
Well, thank you, Al, and thank you, Julie. It's great to be here on your show.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So now, I've listened to you quite a few times and couldn't imagine, but I know there's people that probably don't really know much about you. So tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, where would you like to start?
Well, you're a psychic and lawyer. So where did that start? Like, did you grow up psychic, or did it come along later in your life?
A lot of people find the whole concept of me being both a psychic medium and a lawyer to be somewhat incongruous or in some way diametrically opposed, but they're really not. And I was born a medium. This runs in my family, Al, for generations, on both my mother's and my father's side of the family. In fact, both my parents had mediumistic ability. And my dad's still with us, but he's getting quite elderly, and he doesn't really like talking about it anymore. But when I was about 4 years old, it started to emerge, and I started seeing spirits and had my invisible friends, and my parents understood what was going on because they were aware of it. So that's where this all began, and I was always drawn toward the spiritual. I went to Catholic school in my first 6 years. In fact, when I was a teenager, I was thinking very, very much about going into the clergy, but I decided I didn't want to, and I pursued a career in law instead. And what I like about law is you're actually able to help people, and that's what always drew me to the spiritual, the spiritual aspects, and the possibility of going into the clergy is helping people. But what I've also found, Al, is that both my careers revolve upon evidence. You know, in court, you have to produce evidence to substantiate and to prove your case. And clearly, as a medium, to be taken seriously or credibility, you have to produce evidence. Henceforth, the title of my new bestseller, Evidence of Eternity, which is combining and weaving science, theoretical physics, human physiology, evidence, and theology to demonstrate to the reader that the afterlife does exist and we are capable of communicating with spirits based on sound scientific principles.
What did you think of it when it was starting? I mean, you were obviously born into medium.
Yeah. Well, I didn't think it was weird, but think about most children have invisible friends or they talk to people.
Right.
But when the invisible friends start turning out to be relatives that the child never met, and in my case, certainly there was a number of folks that I'd never met that I was talking about, and the child starts giving details, that's where it's different. And my parents didn't think it was weird. I know that my dad didn't want me talking about it outside of the house, and there's a lot of reasons for that. His family was very conservative. They were very waspy. They were from Pennsylvania, and they were Baptists. In fact, my great-grandfather on that side, one of my great-grandfathers, was a Baptist minister who founded a church. And they kept it very under wraps and very hush-hush, whereas my mother's family, they were from Italy. I mean, my mother's mother was born here. My mother's father emigrated from Italy, and they looked at it as a wonderful gift, and they called it the gift of second sight. So Mom would talk about her abilities openly, whereas Dad was like, don't talk about this outside the house. People will think you're crazy. Because in that era and in the generations and decades before, people who saw spirits were oftentimes considered to be mentally unbalanced. And there's a big difference between paranoid schizophrenia, where you have hallucinations, and psychic mediumship. And the joke I like to say is, if someone comes to you and gives you messages of love, peace, healing, and resolution, that's mediumship. If you hear voices that say, take axe and go kill your lawyer, call the police.
Especially the lawyer part, right?
Yeah, I had a client one time that I was trying a case, and he wouldn't listen to me. And he overruled all my decisions, and I said, fine, I quit. And so, because I'd worked out a deal for simple probation instead of prison, and he was a biker, and the bikers are in the news a lot lately with that shootout where nine guys were killed between the two rival motorcycle gangs, and he was one of those type of people. And I said, look, I can get you 2 years probation. He told me to F off, and he was going berserk and all this. I said, fine, then I quit. Well, he got another lawyer, went to trial, got convicted, and spent 7 years in prison. So one day, fast forwarding into the future, I'm at my office, and in my office, and my secretary's like, no, he's busy, you can't go. And also the door flings open, and I look up, and I'm like, oh, my Lord, and there he is. and he looks older and meaner and nastier, and he had this whole Charles Manson kind of wild hair and beard look, and he just points at me and he said, "Every day for 7 years in prison, I've been thinking about you." And I'm thinking, oh, I'm going to die. This is like that movie Cape Fear where the wacko gets out of prison to go kill his lawyer. And then he goes, "And why I should have listened to you." And I'm like, "So you're not going to kill me?" He goes, "No, I'm not going to kill you." So then, pray tell, why are you here? Well, it kind of violated my parole. Anyway, it's a whole lengthy story, but it's funny now. At the time, it wasn't real funny.
No, it was time to change careers. So, well, I mean, I was going to say, too, also, I mean, you were kind of looking at the clergy, and back then, how would a conservative religious sort of viewpoint talking to the dead, you know?
It depends. It depends because being Catholic, mysticism is integral to the Catholic experience. And unlike our Protestant counterparts, especially the fundamentalists where everything's chapter, line, and verse, Catholics are more concerned with the mystical influences of God, Jesus, Virgin Mary, angels, and saints. So Catholics tend to be very receptive to spirit communication. And if you look at the lives of the popular saints, a lot of them exhibited what we now would describe as psychic and mediumistic abilities. In fact, there's a gentleman by the name of Father Diorio and a woman named Maria Roca, and I've seen both of them in action, and they're energy healers, and they talk about spirit and spirits. Well, in my circles, they would be called either trance mediums, energy healers, or just, mental mediums. But when you join the clergy, you're receiving gifts of the Holy Spirit and visions that are, of the Holy Spirit. When you're not, sanctioned by the church, then, what you're doing is negative. So it just depends on how it's perceived and how it is labeled.
That's on that side. Now, on the lawyer side, how is it that the legal profession treats you knowing that you're a psychic?
Initially, pretty badly. When it wasn't known, I remember when I was a prosecuting attorney, and people would come in other words, as a prosecutor, part of our job is attending what are known as first appearances. And first appearances are when people are initially arrested and they have to be brought before a judge within 24 hours to make a determination of bond and inform them of what they're charged with. And, we would just get a stack of police reports and really didn't have a whole lot of information. I mean, if it was something like, there was a disorderly intoxication and the guy didn't have a bad record, we'd agree to release on his own recognizance. If it was child molestation, no bond. No bond, we won't agree to any release, that type of thing. Well, I remember I was sitting with a couple of the other attorneys, and they'd bring the people in, and I go, that one's a sex offender, that one's burglary, that one looks like a homicide, that one, and that was before I ever looked at the police reports. And I remember one of my colleagues saying, "How do you know that?" I said, "Well, look at them." He goes, "They all look the same." They all look like, pardon my language. Yeah. He goes, "They all look like criminals and dirtbags. How do you know that?" And I said, "Well, you can feel it." They're all looking at me like, "Huh?" So it kind of got to be this weird thing, like, he can just sort of know. And it became a game where Mark would figure out what the people were charged with before they let me look at the report, And so when it hit the news about my book, Never Letting Go, a lot of people in the legal profession, were making fun of me and treating me badly. Others were coming to me. In fact, I've done readings for a number of attorneys, including a few judges. So it was a mixed bag of tricks. But, that's their problem, not mine, and I can't get bent out of shape about it.
Right. Now, do people have a problem hiring you because of that as well?
Oh, I had some people who couldn't wait to hire me. It's like, I want that guy. Because while it doesn't make me invulnerable and all-knowing and all-seeing, and there's a lot of people that really don't understand what it's like to be psychic, they think that somehow I'm omnipresent, which, means I know all, see all, and I don't. And nobody does. Nobody is. God is. We're not. I'm not. And it gives me insights, though. It helps me particularly like in jury selection or discerning things about people. One of the concepts in my new book, Evidence of Eternity, is that grief leads to crime, which leads to grief. And Al, what I found in my law practice is that drug addicts, alcoholics, people that committed impulsive behaviors, oftentimes, most often, had in their developmental years, either as a child or young adult, unresolved death. Be it a parent, a sibling, a grandparent that meant a lot to them, even a pet. And that was never resolved, never, because not everyone's from a family where they'll sit down and have a, Brady Bunch type discussion.
Right.
A lot of people are from, families where there's dysfunction and alcoholism, and they say, don't think about it, dude, don't worry about it, or they start turning to drugs and alcohol. And no matter what, you can't outmaneuver your pain and your grief, and so you sublimate it. In other words, if you try to suppress pain and grief, it's going to emerge in other ways: alcoholism, drug addiction, intense sexual, depravity, impulsive type behaviors. I had this one woman who was a surgeon's wife, and she kept getting arrested stealing junk jewelry from department stores, and she didn't need this, and she was loaded. And during the session with her, I sensed the presence of a male father figure around her, and I asked her, I said, did your father pass when you were quite young? And the tears started coming out, and what it was, I got her into grief counseling because she found that she was doing this to get a high to combat a depression that she never understood, but through counseling began to understand it was because her father died when she was little. She felt abandoned, that he didn't want her. So on a even more intense level, what I've found is that grief leads to people committing criminal acts, which can then lead to inflicting grief upon someone else. So let's say instead of kleptomania, stealing things, you become an alcoholic or a drug addict, and I've seen this happen more times than I care to think, they commit a DUI manslaughter. So their grief caused them to become an alcoholic. They drove a car and they killed somebody else, and now they're inflicting grief upon other people. I've seen this also in impulsive and rage behaviors. So I've used my ability to find out that who the person was who had died, and then I try to get these people into counseling. And what I found is, drug and alcohol counseling is good, but let's get to the root of the problem, which is the grief. So many times it's the grief counseling. Ergo, there's grief, crime, grief, and part of my mission is to break that cycle.
Wow. And so now, you're using your psychic ability in the law practice. So do you draw a line somewhere, or does it just happen and you just take it as it is, or?
Well, currently I'm on a nationwide book tour promoting Evidence of Eternity, and the demand for my services as a medium and a public speaker, a motivational speaker, I've put my law practice on hold, most likely indefinitely, although I still go to the legal seminars and keep up my certification. I'm also a legal analyst in high-profile murders and cases where the legal system, the paranormal collide. I'm on this show. I've appeared on television, on Coast to Coast, Darkness Radio, a lot of other national radio shows as a legal analyst because I've been a prosecutor, criminal defense attorney, a personal injury trial attorney, and I have that experience coupled with my insights into spirituality. And so I've become the go-to guy when the paranormal and the legal system collide. So we're seeing a lot more of that. But what I found, to answer your question directly, it got to the point, Al, where there were some clients I just would not take. I could not handle being in the room anymore with child molesters or forcible rapists. I could not handle being around sociopaths. And I could just tell when these people would walk in, there was just this negative energy, negative aura. And as an attorney, I have to zealously represent somebody, no matter what they're charged with, to to the letter of the law. And I knew that I'd be doing these folks a disservice, so I would refer them to attorneys I knew that specialized in that, and that's what I did. So I did start drawing the line. There were some people I just could not bring myself to defend.
Could you still equate grief or loss to those perpetrators of sexual crimes, etc., as you do with drug and alcohol?
It depends. It depends. There are some people who are just erotically excited by children, and that may be due to being molested themselves, or it may be an integral part of what they are. And so that is a possibility. And even if that were, it was to the point where I just didn't feel I could represent them.
I'm a qualified social worker in the UK and now manage many social workers, and I'm a medium as well. And so it's really interesting for me hearing you talk about, the legal side of things, which of course I'm very heavily involved in terms of family proceedings, and I suppose incorporating the mediumship within your work as an intuition to give you a guidance and feel, but not using it directly. Would you say that is that right? Have I got the hang of that?
Yeah, I mean, it gives me insights, and it certainly guides me through things. I've had people say, "Well, what if the victim's spirit comes forth in a murder trial?" It's like, well, that's great, but that's hearsay. I mean, there's a concept known as double hearsay. I think this
Absolutely,
is like
yeah.
quintuple hearsay. Certainly, psychic intuition and mediumistic impressions are not admissible in a court of law, but that still can guide me as to what I do and the type of things I can look at and bring up.
I guess I'm really interested because I think that from what you were saying is that kind of guidance towards working with a select group of people, and then as you've gone through and you explain you're tired of representing people who who have committed horrific sexual crimes, and you represent those people who you believe to have unresolved grief and loss in their lives.
Yeah.
But we're not sure that really equates to the sexual offending, because that's more about kind of the pleasure center and different components. So it's just interesting the way that you've been steered mediumistically to work with specific groups of people.
Yes, and I've been steered even more so to work with people who want to feel better.
Yeah.
Who want to feel better. I mean, part of the frustration of dealing with criminals is a lot of them don't want to change. Our legal system, both in the U.S. and the U.K., because the Anglo-American prudence is very intertwined. Both countries have an innocent until proven guilty, and mm-hmm. both countries have a lot of the same legal concepts. And our systems can be thought of as 3 R's and a D. The D is deterrence. We create crimes and punishments that are so heavy duty that it deters people. Then there is rehabilitation. That's the lofty goal. This criminal went to prison for 18 months and has been rehabilitated. Yeah. Then there's restraint. Restraint is let's just restrain this person from society for a given period of time. And then there's the base level revenge. And that's where the debate with the death penalty comes in. We see this most recently in that Boston bomber, the Zernayach, the Muslim fanatic who set off a bomb at the Boston Marathon, and he got the death penalty. There's a lot of people saying, well, now you're going to make him a martyr, and now, it would have been better if he was just wafted off to prison, life in prison without parole, and that would be the end of him, and nobody'd ever see him. So we have these 4 different ways or 4 different objectives in our legal system. The highest and loftiest is rehabilitation. And I wish that worked, but the problem is when you send somebody to prison, they end up learning all sorts of things that teach them how to commit crimes better. Better not in the good sense. All right, restraint is the most practical, but it doesn't have any rehabilitative outcome. Revenge, of course, that's base level. I mean, the human being in me wants revenge on people that do things like that. But, there's a difference between vengeance and justice. And then deterrence is assuming that the people who commit these heinous crimes sit down and discuss it ahead of time. So, well, we really can't do that because if we do, we very well may end up with life in prison. And let me, I've been around enough criminals, they don't think about that stuff. They just, they're kind of living in the moment and not in a very positive way.
What is your explanation in the difference between a psychic and a medium?
It's like the difference between AM and FM radio, if you will. And I think that's an easy way to describe it, is that psychics tune into the energy of a person, place, or thing. So let's call that AM radio, which means that if I was doing a psychic reading or Julie was doing a psychic reading, you're picking up on the energy connected with that person, and you can discern past, present, and future events. This is predicated on the theory that time is actually timeless. And it's the type of things that Stephen Hawking and all the way back to Albert Einstein were discussing, that everything that has happened, is happening, and will happen is going on at the same time in the energetic sense. And it's, it takes that type of intellect to even begin to understand that. Someone like a Hawking or an Einstein or a Feynman. And the thought is that psychic ability transcends our linear concept of time, tunes into that AM radio and tunes into the stations of the past, present, future. Mediumistic ability is FM radio. That's tuning into a completely different frequency known as the other side and communicating with discarnate intelligence. Now, taking all the technical out of it, if you want to know about your love life and career, see a psychic. If you want to talk to dead loved ones, see a medium.
It is a good analogy. I like that.
Yeah. And so now getting into your new book, now what's the difference between the evidence of eternity compared to your first book, Never Letting Go?
Never Letting Go, very near and dear to my heart, has positively impacted people on a global scale. I'll never forget, within a month of its release, I received a letter from this woman in Australia who was so distraught over the death of her mother that she was going to commit suicide. And when she got hold of a copy of Never Letting Go, and it changed her mind on that. And I remember talking to my manager, Rocky, and I said to her, all the aggravation and strife that I went through to get a book published, because it's not easy getting a book published, is worth it if I only sold that one book, because it saved somebody's life. Well, then I started getting this whole slew of letters from people who were saying similar things. Never Letting Go is a guide on the journey through grief. Well, while I was on the Never Letting Go book tour, and I was going across the U.S., people started asking me all types of questions about, well, what's the other side like? What happens when you die? Is there a heaven? Is there a hell? Is there a God? My son committed suicide. Did he go to hell? My dog died. Does he have a soul? Or did he just disintegrate? And is there a scientific basis? Is this just hocus pocus? So I started keeping track of the questions, and based on readings, my own research, the survival of consciousness and near-death studies that I've studied, and my study into reincarnation, and I started answering those questions. So evidence of eternity is, it removes the fear and superstition surrounding spirit contact. It explains how spirit communication is possible based on human physiology, on sound scientific principles, on a reference to theoretical physics, like I just explained with the AM-FM analogy, and then also how there's a theological basis or a theological explanation for a lot of this, because a lot of people come up to me and they start flinging this, mediums are not a god, and they start flinging all this nonsense at me from Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And if I'm offending anyone's religious beliefs, I'm sorry about that, but I'm sorry there's just some things I just can't take seriously. I mean, especially when later in the Bible you start seeing references to spirit communication and mediumship in a very positive manner. And it wasn't just in that religion, it was also in Judaism, in Hinduism, and Buddhism. And so the great spiritual teachers have been aware of this. It's just that people get afraid and they start, creating all these superstitious trappings to make it negative. So evidence of eternity pushes all that aside and says, this is how this works. These are the phenomenons, and I developed a whole series of new terms and concepts to explain this in 21st century understanding. Because heretofore, our understanding of spirit communication was pretty much coined in Britain and the U.S. in the Victorian era. And Julie, I know in Britain, mediumship is very well studied, but there's all sorts of terms and concepts that were developed in the heyday of spiritualism, and yet they have not been updated. And that's what evidence of eternity does. Because it's a science, it's a field of study, and it has to grow and it has to evolve.
One of the things I was just thinking about as you were talking there, Mark, was I suppose whilst I'm with you, because obviously as being a medium, in many ways I cannot not be with you on this, but there's one of the things that I guess people who are more skeptical to mediumship would be saying was actually you've got a completely captive audience with when you're I suppose homing in on grief as being the cause of a lot of people's difficulties and unresolved grief, because clearly they're a very vulnerable group of individuals, and in some ways evidencing mediumship is harder with those people that have a more I suppose balanced view of people passing over and don't have unresolved grief. Does that make sense? I've probably overcomplicated that, but
it makes perfect sense. Well, there's some people who are never going to believe, and I don't even call them skeptics, they're cynics. Because a true skeptic is an intelligent person who says, I don't know. I would like to see some proof, as opposed to, I don't know, I don't believe, I don't want to believe, and you're wrong, and this is pseudoscience, and you're cold reading, and you're a fraud. Okay, that's not a skeptic, that's a cynic. And unfortunately, there's a lot of cynics running around, casting all kinds of aspersions. And then on the other side, you have religious fanatics who go around slinging Bronze Age superstitions at us as if that is somehow logical or really has any meaning. And that's the problem. People think that faith and science are diametrically opposed, and I don't think that they are. In fact, when I start looking at the philosophy and the root of all the major religions, they seem to be in tandem with our understanding of energy neither being created nor destroyed, only transferred. The soul, the spirit pre-exists the body and then lives on after the body. When you start looking at it in those terms, it does have a great harmony. I know I'm getting a little off topic there, but that's how I'm looking at it, is that some people will never believe because they have a closed mind, but most people will at least listen and think about it.
When we make decisions as individuals about changing our thoughts, our behaviours, our understanding, we go through a process, don't we, of change. And if we just look very simplistically at a model of change, we have to weigh up the benefits of a belief system to ourselves. And you've incorporated quite a few belief systems as you grew up, different religious backgrounds, different understanding. You've spoken quite a lot about your belief in God, but you've also struggled with some parts of the Bible and some of the arguments people therefore give as a result of the Bible. Where does your religious standing sit now? Given that some mediums would say, well, I'm a spiritualist and this is what this means to me, and other people would say, well, I'm very much a Christian and I work along these views. Where do you sit now?
I would say that I am a spiritual Catholic, and I would also say that God exists in spite of religion, not because of religion. So I definitely believe in God.
Uh-huh.
And I believe that all religions, I'm going to quote one of your fellow countrymen, one of my favorite celebrities of all times, George Harrison.
Yeah.
And he said something very profound. All religions are branches of one big tree, and it doesn't matter what you call God, just so long as you call. And that's kind of where I'm at now, because I've studied Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Native Americanism, Shintoism, Taoism, and they all have such beautiful lessons and beautiful teachings. Where religions go wrong is when it turns into we're right, you are wrong, and because you don't believe the way we do, you're a heretic, an infidel, a blasphemer, and evil. And the problem with religion is it mires a lot of people into Bronze Age and Iron Age primitive backward thinking, and it also fosters the us versus they syndrome. We believe in this religion. We have the superior religion. You don't believe this, therefore you are evil and we can kill you. And we're seeing that going on all over the world. And I don't recall Jesus saying, kill people in my name, nor do I ever recall him saying, we're all the children of God, comma, except for the following people. Buddha certainly never said that. You don't see that in the Hindu teachings, and really you don't see it in any of the enlightened religions. At the root of all religions, and this is a lecture I give, it's be nice. I mean, I'm not being flippant when I say that. It's be nice. Treat people the way you want to be treated. Do not do to people what you do not want done to you. If you think about it, all the religions are based on, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, which is, one of the laws of physics. You can call it the law of karma. You can call it the law of cause and effect, as they do in mystical Judaism. Even in the book of Galatians, whatever a man shall reap, so he shall sow. So we're seeing once again this balance, which seems to occur in nature, also occurs energetically, also occurs spiritually. So it all comes down to be nice.
It couldn't be simpler, could it?
Well, I mean, think about it. What did Jesus tell people? Be nice. Be nice.
I
Buddha said,
totally agree.
Be nice.
If that was
funny.
If that was the foundation of, well, it is, I guess, the foundation of every religion. If that was the only component of every religion, we'd be okay.
It is, and it's so funny because a friend of mine is a fundamentalist Christian, or he was raised that way. He's kind of gotten away from it now. He said, my family thinks that you're going to hell. I go, why? Because I'm a medium? He goes, no, because the way you were baptized. I go, what do you mean? I was baptized in church by a priest. He goes, yeah, but that's not the right way of being baptized. You have to be taken into a pool of water or a river and dunked underneath and then pulled up. Otherwise, you have not been baptized properly. I'm like, all right, so let me see if I understand this. The omnipotent, transcendent being, which is God, which transcends all time and space, and is the source of all love, light, and power, really cares if I got dunked in a pool? It's like it just is hysterical and sad that there's so many people who actually believe those type of things and then use their faith in God to justify their hateful, angry, bigoted political agendas.
Wow, I couldn't have said that better myself.
Well, it's just like I try to avoid politics, you know, because
I know.
I think, and just to be fair and balanced, I think both the parties in the U.S. have failed the American people miserably. So, it's like I believe in reincarnation. I really wish Teddy Roosevelt would reincarnate and run and get elected president.
It's just I know what you're saying. I agree. Well,
so in terms of, sorry, Al, in terms of the new book, Mark, what is eternity?
What is eternity?
What is it?
Eternity, you can refer to that as heaven, God, everlasting life. And I like to look at it as an amalgamation of all that. And the really difficult part, and I remember when when I first started thinking in abstract terms, I was about 8 or 9 years old, and I was in Catholic Church, and they said always was and always will be. I mean, that's a big thing, in several of our prayers. God always was and always will be. And I started thinking about, well, always was, and I'm like, my mind couldn't do it. And then as I got older, and then I started studying not only law but psychology and studying the human brain, I realized we can't conceive of always was and always will be, because the human mind is a finite creation, and it is an organ, albeit an extremely complex one, but it is designed specifically to only process things on a finite basis, because everything that we experience while living in the material world has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And our spirit, our consciousness, is an immortal living being which, once freed from the confines of the body and the human brain, the mind, is able to perceive always was, always will be. Time is timeless, and everything is going on energetically at the same time. And some people think that in our finite state that we're somehow handicapped, and I don't see it that way. For whatever reason or reasons, we are sent to live in the material world and to experience things that you cannot when you're in an infinite state. And an infinite state means your energy. You don't get old, you don't get sick, you don't die, you don't get sad. They're in this incredible state. But here in the material world, we can experience all those things. We can feel the pain and the remorse and the guilt and the horror. And it appears that this is part of our spiritual development. Now, I don't pretend to have all the answers, but what spirits have conveyed to me in thousands of readings, you've probably got this too, Julie, is that everything that we go through in this material world existence is for a reason, and it relates directly to what we're going to learn and how we're going to evolve once we revert back to a spiritual state. And I'm like, oh, goodness gracious, there are some days I could really do without these lessons. Like a lot of days.
Yeah.
And for folks who are suffering with the loss of a loved one, you don't need a jerk with a pitchfork running around throwing people into hell. When you've lost a child, when you're suffering from the death of a loved one, you are in hell. Hell is here on earth. I don't believe in the archetypical hell. That, to me, is once again a bunch of medieval superstitious nonsense where the Romans and then later medieval kings and then the Muslims created a boogeyman to threaten people that if you don't obey this political agenda and this religious dogma, then you are cast into this fiery pit of hell. I just don't buy that. In fact, most of the spiritual people that I've worked with do not believe in that. Hell is a metaphor for what we go through here on earth. The devil is a metaphor for the human ego. If you want to, if you don't need a guy with a pitchfork to motivate you to commit horrific and terrible acts. All you have to do is act in the most self-centered manner possible, and then that's going to lead to all this horror that we inflict on each other.
Can I ask you a little bit about the paranormal side of things? Because on your website it talks about being a paranormal expert, and do you do paranormal investigations, and where might you go? What's your favorite investigation been?
I've been on several. My favorite was at the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park in Colorado. Number one, Estes Park is absolutely beautiful. It's right next to the entrance of Rocky Mountain National Park. So, I mean, for no other reason, you should go experience that. It's just breathtakingly beautiful. But I've been in a number of investigations with the paranormal experts, and they've got all their equipment set up, their K2 meters and the EVP and all these other devices, and you can see the energy start spiking when spirits come in. And what I found is the problem with a lot of the investigations, people that go into this, and not all of them, so I certainly don't mean to offend my colleagues that are paranormal investigators, but a lot of them, or several of them, go into this with, we're looking for demons, we're looking for negative energies, and already you have the mindset. And the scientific method is predicated upon not having any preconceived notions, but strictly observing dispassionately. That's a tough thing for people to do. Because I've been in a number of ones that go, it's a demon, and I remember I started communicating with the entity, and it wasn't a demon; it was a non-human spiritual intelligence. You could call it an elemental. I know that words like fairy and sprite and pixie and all that, people will snicker about that, but those are names given in the British Isles to a lot of these energies, leprechauns and things like that. And they don't, they're not the guy jumping around out of the Lucky Charms box. This is an energy that is aligned with plants, animals, minerals, earth. In other words, human spirits and angelic entities seem to be aligned and like to work with human beings and human entities. And a lot of the non-human spiritual intelligence on the other side seems to be aligned with things that are not human and non-human, and they have their reasons for doing that. And we can communicate with them as well. It's just very different. It's very different.
What was the reason that you enjoyed that investigation so much?
It was a lot of fun. I was there with Dave Schrader from Darkness Radio and Aaron Godwin and a bunch of the guys from TV, and basically we just had a really good time. I guess it was just the camaraderie, and also working with the Stanley Hotels team. They have a team on site which has been studying this, and they said that my observations coincide with their investigation. And I think that may be why I enjoyed that one so much, is because once I got past to the guys who were running around screaming demon, 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 and I was working with paranormal investigators that were actually employing the scientific method, they said that what I was observing and what my conclusions coincided with their research. And it was really nice being able to discuss that without trying to turn it into Demon Fest.
I think definitely there's a real difference in stepping out on stage and giving an evening of mediumship or an intimate evening with, as opposed to a paranormal investigation where, certainly from my own experiences, I find that you're almost wading through levels of activity and spiritual contact. And by levels, I mean different ages, eras. There's a lot going on that you have to kind of understand and differentiate and hone down to the information that you actually need. Whereas I can step out on stage and be very clear exactly who it is I need to go to. I think that's a very different way of reading. Do you find the same?
Yes, I do.
It's if you had a preference, what would it be? How do you enjoy the historic side of paranormal investigation? Is there anything particular that you're interested within? I mean, I, for example, I really enjoy. There's a specific place here that we go to. It's got layers and layers of history. I've probably investigated it 3 times before, but it's something that never fails to give activity. There is always something that I have to really question. So what side of, whereas mediumship comes quite easily to me, and I can bring up information very quickly. What type of investigation do you prefer?
I don't really have a preference. I look at each experience as a new and exciting opportunity. But when I was in the UK, when I was in London a few years back, I went to the Tower of London.
Yeah.
I couldn't resist. I mean, how can you not want to go to the Tower of London? And I was walking around, and it was a nice, chilly February day, and I sat down on this one bench, and I'm looking around. All of a sudden, I started thinking about Anne Boleyn, and I said, I know that she was beheaded. I wonder where they beheaded Anne Boleyn. And I swear to God, and I got pictures to prove I took the pictures. I look over, and there's this sign next to me that said, here is where Queen Anne Boleyn was, beheaded. And I'm like, oh my God. And I'm not saying that Anne Boleyn came to me, but I find it very interesting that I sat down and started thinking about her and wondering where she was beheaded, and I happened to be sitting on the spot where it happened.
What did you make of, I don't know whether you saw it, but I'm sure you would have heard of it. Some years ago, we've got Derek Akora, who is a very respected medium here. Do you know of Derek?
Only by reputation.
His reputation, I think, in fairness to Derek, is twofold. As with many mediums, he was on a very popular television program called Most Haunted.
Yes.
And there was some experiments done as a result of that within the program that he was deemed to be fake. Now, I think most mediums go through that kind of pressure. When he goes on stage, he's an amazing medium. He's absolutely on the ball. But I guess the reason why I've brought him into that is because you can be the best medium in the world and be tested by the media to such a degree that you end up becoming a medium that appeases the public. Does that make sense? So, for example, on television programs, there is a pressure because of the time and resources, finances, etc., to come up with information that may or may not be evidential in order to meet the demands of the public. Do you feel that pressure at all?
Of course, and it's all in technique. I've been on television a lot, and the problem with being on TV is the segments are usually 7 minutes between commercials.
Yeah.
And, doing a reading in 7 minutes, especially when the person that you're doing a reading for is not used to being in front of cameras, an audience, lights, and all they're saying is, I don't know, no, that's not right, no, that's not right, no, that's not right. And then when the cameras go off, they're like, oh my God, that was amazing, that was my mother, you got everything. And I've had that happen, and it's like, and you can't get annoyed with the person that you're reading, because I'm a public speaker, you're a public speaker, you're used to it, but it's still nerve-wracking when you're on TV. It's like, all right, now perform. And then all of a sudden you're in the middle of a reading of, we're going to a commercial break. And then you got to put, heaven on hold for 4.5 minutes, and then you get back into it. And so that's why television readings are very challenging. And it takes a bit to get warmed up and start establishing the link with the spirits. You got to develop the rapport, the spirits start working. This isn't texting or instant messaging. And it's easy for the cynics and the naysayers to sit there, oh, they're cold reading, they're wrong. Because until you do this and until you experience it, either as a medium or a client, you really don't understand it. And it's easy to say no, when the answer should be yes, yes, yes. It's not putting everything together. I mean, the other day last week I was in Atlanta on tour, and I was doing a reading in public, and these folks, their son came through, and I said, he's showing me a fish. Show me fish. No. And so then I moved on to somebody else, and then they stood up again. They said, oh, sorry, we don't mean to interrupt, but you kept saying, our son, you're getting a fish. Said his name was Finn.
Oh.
Okay. Now...
I totally get that, and I've said this before.
Yeah, you get it, because it takes time for the energy, and when you get no, and it's not that they were knowing me, they just weren't making the connection. And it's like I was doing a reading for this woman one time, and I said, I'm seeing an apple, a Macintosh apple. No. And then I said, well, something about Marilyn. She goes, wait a second. She goes, one of my good friends, Marilyn McIntosh, died about 2 months ago. Okay? And so when you put all that together, and information that comes through doesn't always come in sequential order. Our conversation tends to go from point A to point B to point C to point D. Because we're using one concept at a time, we're limited. Once again, this is our finite versus an infinite experience. A finite being, like you and I, are communicating using auditory frequency, sending one concept at a time back and forth to each other. Spirits don't have that limitation. They can hit us with 20, 30, or however many concepts at one time. So that's why things don't always come out name, rank, and serial number, because they're sending so many concepts. We may pick up these 3 or 4. They don't really tie together until 20 minutes later when we start putting all those other ones together. Henceforth, like I get Macintosh, and then 10 minutes later I get the name Marilyn. It's like, oh my God, Marilyn Macintosh.
Yeah.
So
when I first started doing public demonstrations, I remember being stood at the front of a fairly large spiritualist church audience, and I kept getting the picture of Postman Pat. It's a children's television program here. And I couldn't work out, and nobody could understand this Postman Pat. I couldn't make a link anywhere. And I really was like a terrible comedian, just going down the pan really quickly. And I was stood at the front of this audience for what seemed like a decade, but probably was a matter of minutes. And all of a sudden, I was in my head, I was obviously asking my guide, saying, please make this a bit clearer. I cannot do this. This is madness. I'm stood up here in front of all these people and not getting anything. And I saw a picture of myself that morning opening a British gas, a fuel bill. And so I put that out to the audience, who today has had a British gas bill? And this gentleman in the audience said, well, that's me. And I said, well, what's the relevance? Why is that significant? He said, because I don't get British gas. I said, okay, now who's Pat? He said, here's my son. So I had the post, I had man, and I had Pat. But actually getting the Postman Pat from a cartoon was a nightmare. But that's how the message was given, and I had to try and unpick it, which was really very funny at the end of the day when people were saying, oh, that's so true, Postman and Pat. But the way it came through was almost like, well, I thought I was dying up there for a minute.
Well, and that happens, and you have to keep your cool and work with it. And that's where the cynics who don't understand this and make no effort to even begin to understand, they don't get how this comes in. I was doing a reading for this lady, and all of a sudden I saw an octopus. Now, I almost didn't say anything, but then I said, well, I'm seeing an octopus. And she started laughing, and I go, what? She said, well, I used to live in Belize, and my husband and I, and her husband was the one that was communicating, and she said, we used to catch lobsters, and we put them in this pool, which was overlooking a canal. It was a saltwater pool, and we put lobsters in there. And one morning we came out, and there was an octopus that slithered up out of the canal and was stealing our lobsters. And she said, "Do you think that's what he's talking about?" I said, "Well, unless you have another octopus story, I'm kind of yeah." and things like that happen. I was doing a gallery event with this woman, and she was going to sit down, and all of a sudden I started seeing that old movie star Joan Crawford. And I said, this sounds weird, but before you sit down, does Joan Crawford mean anything to you? And she started laughing so hard, she goes, oh my God. She goes, my husband died of cancer, and I had to take care of him, and one day he accused me of being mommy dearest. which is, I guess, that movie Mommy Dearest was about Joan Crawford and how mean she was. And I just kind of let that one go. I mean, the crowd was laughing and I was laughing. I mean, it was great. It was funny. But people don't understand until you see it work, because what happens is the spirit's pure consciousness. They start vibrating intelligence to us, and there's a concept that comes and it begins to build and develop. And sometimes it is real quick and very direct, but a lot of times it takes working with them, and they may give us an image, like you got the Postman Pat, or I got an image of Joan Crawford, or whatever, to get what the true message is.
I remember, in the early days myself, having information coming through as that thought process, as that imagery, and I really couldn't make sense of it. And I was stood on stage one day, and my son, who is in his 20s now, was stood at the back of the room, and he said, you read like John Edward. He said, your mannerism, the imagery, how you're relaying information, the speed at which you're doing it is like John Edward. And I hadn't really observed many other mediums. And I think years and years ago as a child, I'd been taken to see Doris Stokes, a very famous medium here. And I was 12 when I went to see her in London. And so I grabbed a couple of John Edward's books, and just hearing the experiences of other mediums and how the information is relayed and how you understand it absolutely put me into a position of comfort. I felt completely as though actually this is on the right wavelength. This is the best way of describing how I'm receiving this information, because I really didn't know how to describe that to people in the early days. I'm just thinking now, I mean, I've mentioned John Edward. If you could work with any other medium, who would it be and why?
He's supposed to say you.
I like working by myself. Because I've worked with other mediums, and sometimes they jump to conclusions. I was working with this one on a TV show, and this woman in the audience, her father came through, and I said, "I'm seeing a man in uniform. I'm seeing a badge, and I'm hearing." And she said, "Well, my father was a police officer." I said, "I'm hearing shots," or the word shot. And the other medium jumps up and says, "Yeah, I'm hearing shots too. He was shot in the line of duty." And the woman said, "No, he was in a bar with his friends doing shots of whiskey, and he got a heart attack and died." And this poor person I was working with, she goes, "Oh," I mean, it looked really bad for her. And after the show, I said, "You got to be careful." I wasn't chastising her. I said, "We were hearing shots, and you got to be very careful about making assumptions. Because he was a police officer and you heard shots, therefore your brain filled in the blanks that therefore he must have been shot by a gun on duty, when actually he was doing drinking shots, which triggered a heart attack and killed him."
Do you think that if you I've assumed there then, have you worked with a medium where it has been a really positive experience for you?
Oh, sure, lots of times. I mean, I don't look at it as a negative thing. It's just that I just prefer to work on my own. But I certainly am always open to working with somebody who's good.
I think I totally get where you're coming from, because it's really difficult to stand on stage with someone or in a position where you are giving very sensitive information and looking at somebody and knowing that what's coming from their mouth isn't right. Or isn't, and a lot of people will say, well, that's because sometimes mediums tune into different things, and I don't really buy that. I think we can tune into different things. I think we can get different information, but I think straight away when that is happening. We had an experiment on stage in the last few years where we made a link, myself and another colleague, we made a link. He made the first link, I gave the names, they all corresponded, so we brought the person up on the stage, and we went off and just looked at, we were on the other side, different sides of the stage, and we were looking towards the back, so we couldn't see the audience. And the audience could see this individual's face, they could see whether the information we were giving was okay or not. And it was a really powerful demonstration of how two mediums can totally link into the same spirit and give information that is really validating the existence of spirit energy to that individual, because it was so raw. The audience could see exactly what was happening with that person's expressions, their understanding of what was being said. If she looked confused, it was clear. It was a very, very powerful demonstration. But there are very few mediums that I would feel comfortable doing that with. And I think once you find somebody, it's great.
Yeah, I've done that a number of times where you're in the same link, and it's really fascinating. And don't get me wrong, I do like working with other people, but when I'm doing my events, I prefer to work alone because when you do work with more than one person, then it either can go really well or it can go not so well. But I'm certainly open to doing that. If no proof is necessary for those who do not, none may be possible. Now that has been said in the spiritual arena for a long time. I know that there's a lot of scientists that believe that consciousness is created by the brain, period. But then recently I was a speaker with on the same stage with Dr. Evan Alexander, who wrote Proof of Heaven, and he and I were discussing this. In a book about the human brain, when you're learning how to become a neurobiologist or a brain surgeon, the book is about the functions of the brain. There may be one paragraph of what consciousness is. So the people and the scientists who say that, consciousness does not exist separately from the brain, it's created by the brain, they cannot offer a plausible, much less a logical explanation of what does cause consciousness. There's others that say, well, if you affect this brain sector, you can recreate a spiritual experience. It's like, so what? All that means is that physiological response, being part of our equipment, is part of the delivery system of how we perceive that. It's like saying, I can recreate a holographic projection of an airplane, but that doesn't mean it's an airplane. Just because you can artificially recreate something doesn't make it real. And just because something is, I just don't buy that consciousness is created by the human brain. And the reason that I say this, and Julie, I'm sure you agree, is that for thousands of readings with discarnate intelligence, this information's coming from somewhere. And yes, and I know the Bible thumpers, it's demons. It's like, stop it with that. This is proof that consciousness survives your physical death. I mean, when I'm on a telephone reading and I bring up an octopus from a woman that has a bizarre octopus story, really? How's that cold reading?
Yeah, definitely.
How does your book deal with the issues of like homicide, murder, suicide?
Those are very delicate subjects. Homicide, I mean, as an attorney, I've dealt with so many people who have had a family member who's been murdered, and it's just horrible. And the spirits of murdered people come through, and they're not here screaming for vengeance. They tend to be in a place of great love and peace and forgiveness. And it's important for people who've been through that to understand that their loved one on the other side is doing quite well. Now, does that make it all better? Certainly not, because we all, and this is a very normal and a very human thing, get very caught up in the death and dying aspect of our loved ones, especially when they're taken from us. Now, for people who've committed murders, I cover that as well in Evidence of Eternity, and how they're trying to reconcile it here in the material world. And I go into great depth about a prisoner that I corresponded with who's on death row, and how he's trying to make sense of his life after committing an incredibly horrifying murder. Suicide is so much more than just self-inflicted homicide, and there are all types of karmic repercussions. All the great religions basically say if you commit suicide, you're going to hell, and what I found is it really doesn't work that way. And I'm certainly not encouraging any of the listeners for 1 second to consider suicide as an option, but people need to realize that if one of their loved ones has committed suicide, that there is no one-size-fits-all as to what happens. And there's all types of reasons why people commit suicide, and it's hard for us to sit in judgment of someone who does that. We need to look at them with compassion and understanding. So Evidence of Eternity goes very deep into understanding crime, homicide, suicide, and how they all interact with each other on the other side. It's really fun when mediums get together and we start talking shop, and then you realize that there's people around who aren't mediums, and they at other tables and things are like, oh my God.
But I think actually that makes a really good interview, because it's more candid, and I think when two mediums get together and they're just talking about the day-to-day practicalities and the difficulties with mediumship and the complexities and the misunderstandings. I think people then, and you're just talking generally, you don't have to soup it up. You don't have to put, different wordings around it or to make it more complex than it needs to be.
Sure.
Quite often I will get on stage and I will say, there will be people out there that say, this isn't about spirits. This isn't about the afterlife. This isn't about eternity. This isn't about guidance and healing. And I say, all I can tell you is that I know what I know. And I don't always understand exactly the reason why I know what I know, but I do. And I will relay that message to you if it's there. And that message, if that absolutely fits with you, I want you to say, absolutely, that's it. That is exactly what it is I want you to hear, or that makes absolute sense. Please do not make this leap of faith. If I say, hang on, I'm hearing this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm feeling, and I'm, say, for example, using the name, I don't know, Matthew, please don't say, oh yes, it was Darren. That's the one. And make that huge leap that's not factually correct because of a need to make contact with somebody. And so I'm really honest when I first step on stage just to explain those things. And I think people really are more receptive to it because it's just usual language. This is what happens when we're feeling vulnerable. We have a desire to make contact. We want something to make us feel better. So we make this huge leap of faith, and that's not what I'm here to do. I think we see
a good way of looking at it, because we don't tell people what they want to hear. And
no.
That's what the critics are like. Oh, you just tell people what you want to hear. It's like, yeah, well, obviously you don't understand mediumship. That's not what it's about.
We had we've got a program here called Psychic TV, and you have to go through a various interviews and readings, etc., to be able to go on Psychic TV. And I remember going into London for this interview, and I thought I'd turned up in the wrong studios. I don't know if you've heard of the television station, Babe Station, but basically it's a lot of very beautiful women on poles, and they look great, but I turned up there thinking I'm completely in the wrong studio, and had my interview with all of these pole dancers behind me on screens. Most bizarre thing ever. But Psychic TV is something that there are so many rules around television here that you're not allowed to use the word medium. You're not allowed to be able to talk about any individual person that's come through. So in order to kind of understand that process and how it feels to be a medium and not be able to give that information, I had a reading myself just as a lay person. I rang in, I paid my £30 for 20 minutes or whatever it was, and this gentleman, I could hear him stirring his cup of tea in the kitchen while he was giving me a reading, obviously working from home. And I thought, this is madness, it's not professional, it's not. And then straight away my hackles were up, I guess, and I was pessimistic. And he told me I would end up with, and Al will laugh at this, he told me that I would end up with a man in uniform. This man will be taller than me. And I was thinking, this is crazy. At the time, I was engaged to be married to somebody who was about my own height, who was never in a uniform. It just wasn't happening. And I thought, how ridiculous. And the whole process, the whole experience from ringing in the non-professional service, somebody who seemed quite dismissive, just making a cup of tea while he was talking to me, that whole experience led me to think that whole reading was not worth the time I'd spent having it. And it was only several years later when, I am now married to a man in uniform, and those things have kind of transpired, but I totally dismissed the reading in that moment because of how it was presented to me. So I think it's so important that when we do speak to people that we have that professional component, but we also have that empathy and understanding. But that professionalism is a must, because otherwise people don't take the messages away.
Exactly. That's a very good point.
And did you learn how to work the pole as well?
Do you know, it was bizarre. It was quite bizarre. Yeah, and as I turned around, behind me was just all these screens and these women on poles and with their telephones in their hands saying, "Call me," and all these things. And I was like, wow, I'm having an interview to be a medium on here with all this going on. But it was, it was entertaining.
Okay. Okay, on that note.
I didn't go near the pole. I didn't go anywhere near the pole.
Oh, sure.
I can tell you now.
That's how she got the man in the uniform.
Aha, well, no. I'm going to say no more.
Well, now let's get on to your book. Now, how do people get a hold of your book?
It's pretty easy. It's on sale worldwide at all fine bookstores like Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, all independently owned bookstores. And it's funny because people will email me and say, well, I went to Barnes & Noble and it was out of stock. It's like, okay, then go to the customer service desk and they'll order it for you. And I don't mean to be facetious, but it's amazing that bookstores are very helpful, and they will be very, very happy to order your copy of Evidence of Eternity. You can also obtain it online at Amazon.com, both Amazon in the U.S. and Amazon UK. It is available worldwide in all countries where English is spoken. If you go to my website, evidenceofeternity.com, it'll show you where you can order it from Amazon.com, Walmart.com, BarnesandNoble.com. And I guess I've arrived because I hear that it's also on eBay.
And how do people get a hold of you if they want to contact you personally? Same
website, evidenceofeternity.com. You can go to the Book a Reading page, and please read the entire page. It'll answer most of your questions. And then if you feel that this is something you want to do, go ahead and fill out the form and submit it to us. I will be in Los Angeles on tour in June, between June 22nd, which is Monday, and Friday, June 25th. In fact, I'll be conducting live events at the Mystic Journey bookstore in Venice. For more information, people can go to evidenceofeternity.com, and they can go to my calendar of events. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter. All those events will be posted there as well.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to come and do the interview, and it's been very interesting.
It has. Thanks, Mark.
Oh, you are so welcome. You're so welcome. And it was my pleasure. Thank you both.
So where do you see, just one last point that I think would be probably quite nice to finish on really, is where do you see you taking your gift in the future?
You know, I've learned a very important lesson in life, that life is like a river, flow with it and not against it. So I'm just flowing with it. And the thing about the river of life is it has beautiful, calm pools, and it has shimmering vistas, but it also has whitewater rapids and waterfalls. And you have to take all of it in stride and just look at it as it's all part of the experience, because life is a journey, not a destination.
That is a smooth answer, Mark Anthony.
There we have it. Is there anything else you wanted to add or talk about?
Just that folks can find out more about me at evidenceofeternity.com. And please like my Facebook page, because all of my public speaking events, media appearances, personal appearances will all be posted there. And I can't thank both of you enough, Al and Julie, for having me on. And it's just been a really great interview. And to all the listeners, may God bless you. And realize that no matter what life throws at you, You're going to get through it, and that you must never fear because the presence of God is always near. And there's something that keeps me going. There's a lot of days, living in the material world is a privilege, but there's a lot of days that it really doesn't feel that way. And Mother Teresa gave me the best advice of all, is that God never gives me more than I can handle, but I just wish God didn't trust me so much.
Tune in tomorrow. Same bat time, same bat channel.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of the Z-Talk Radio Network.
I'll be back.